A new European Union going green policy could hit Africa hard. Known as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, the rule takes effect in January of 2026. It is designed to cut emissions and imposes a punitive carbon tax on all manufactured goods entering the European Union. For Africa, a continent whose contribution to global carbon emissions is just about 4%, it will reverse gains in manufacturing, slow down industrialization, cut jobs, and push the continent further down the global value chain. The Africa Development Bank says in terms of trade with the European Union, Africa stands to lose $25 billion annually. So this week on the program, we ask, will the European Union's green path hurt Africa? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. So what does this carbon border tax really mean for Africa's manufacturing and efforts to industrialize? To help us unpack this, I'm joined by our panel of experts. With me in studio, Churchill Ogutu, economist at IC Group. Joining us from Lagos, Tunji Andrews, CEO Awaba. And in Johannesburg via Zoom, Dean Bekemuzi Bebe, Senior Just Energy Transitions and Campaign Advisor at PowerShift. A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us in this discussion. Tunji, let me start off with you, because the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, has been called a bold climate tool, but Africa calls it carbon tax or green protectionism. Is the EU's carbon border tax really about carbon emissions or about trade?
You want to look at it from the perspective that we have been exporting raw materials to the EU for decades, and it's never been a problem. It's now that we're adding the value to it that it's now beginning to become a problem. It does kind of bring to question that while Africa was exporting only raw materials, this did not exist, and now there is a move to be able to tax added value to the raw materials produced in Africa, and it just feels like something is not adding up and is trying to stifle Africa's industrialization attempts.
Right, let me get your thoughts here, Dean. Is this about carbon emissions or is it about trade?
The new tariff is the EU's, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, as you said, scheduled to begin in January, and really it's a carbon tax on imports. And European importers of African goods like steel, aluminium, and fertilizers will now have, to purchase CBAM certificates, essentially paying the same carbon price like EU producers, that are now currently paying under the bloc's emissions trading system. On paper, it looks like a way to level the playing field, but in reality, it risks becoming a barrier for African exports. For Europe, this is about climate policy, but for Africa, it's about survival. And these are precisely the value-added sectors where the continent is finally beginning to move beyond raw commodities. And the African Development Bank warns the mechanism could cost up to 25 billion every year, undermining jobs, industrialization. So while Europe frames CBAM as climate responsibility and emissions reduction, Africa experiences it as a direct hit on its growth prospects.
Well, Dean, from where you're sitting, though, and from Africa's standpoint, should we see this as a threat or as an opportunity?
Essentially, I think we should see this as a threat, because essentially at one point, we are being charged to a tax on goods that have been manufactured using fossil fuels, for example, right? And one of the key arguments that Africa deserves to transition, and we don't have the means of implementation. By that, I mean the right climate finance coming into Africa, be it quantity and quality. But the global north consistently refuses then to also support Africa in that light. But the same people have then come up with this tax that then creates this ecosystem that is very unlikely to create a level playing field, particularly within Africa.
Churchill, what do you think will be the impact of this tax, though, on those countries that are exporting to the European Union?
Looking at even this particular tax that is coming, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, there are specific sectors that they are looking at slapping the tax on, the fertilizers, the aluminium, which have some higher intensity. So you find that those sectors might be heavily impacted. The sectors that are based in Africa that are exporting these goods to European Union, they'll be heavily impacted. The other issue also is around the costing, because this, as my fellow panelists have mentioned, they want to level the playing field in the sense that the cost of exporting the products into the European countries, that cost, you find that the cost of production in Africa, on the African continent, is different from how it is in the European continent. But now you'll find that they'll be paying the same amount of the pricing. So that's a bit prohibitive if you think about it, the cost element.
Right. So Tunji, let me come back to the whole concept of this is about leveling the playing ground, because initially the carbon tax was applying only to companies that were operating within the European Union. But now those imports from Africa will be subjected to the same surcharges as domestically produced goods that use carbon-intensive methods. Is CBAM saving the planet or saving European industry?
I think it's about saving European industries. It's very clear to me. And you need to understand, because we could talk about the fact that there are other industries that could still thrive, but it is very pertinent that these particular sectors are the ones that are being standouts on the African continent. A Nigerian businessman, Aliko Dangote, signing a $2.5 billion deal with Ethiopia for a fertilizer plant. Dangote in Nigeria is producing fertilizer. He's producing cement. He's doing quite a bit in the oil and gas sector. But those are, if you look across the continent, that is where we seem to begin to have a competitive advantage, where we might start to emerge as some sort of global players in the entire world. And I do not think that this is the right time to do this, because when the industries in the EU zone were thriving, there was really very little conversation. But now it does feel like we are coming through. And again, I must say, the conversation around cost of production, it is a global trade conversation. It has always happened across the world. Aluminum, and those particular areas that have been slapped with tariffs. So I think this is a conversation where Africa needs to collectively respond as a bloc, because this feels like a threat. To me, it feels like a threat to industrialization on the African continent, because this is the first time we're doing something this big on this magnitude, and they're trying to stifle our growth.
Churchill, in terms of responding collectively, though, the EU did introduce this new tax without negotiating or involving, the African Union or African government or other developing regions that will be affected. What does this say, though, about the whole question of inclusivity when it comes to global decision making on climate decisions?
Yeah, evidently, there's a case to be made that European Union moved on its own when it implemented this policy. But if you look at the context behind it, European Union started with the emissions trading system that has been in place from 2003. So there was the transition phase up until 2005. And then from there, from 2006 all the way to 2013, 2014, thereabouts, they started now implementing. So you could find that some of the companies based in Europe will now move offshore outside Europe so as to be able to import at a much more advantageous tariff into the European Union. So from that perspective of leveling the playing ground, that's where they sort of now brought in this particular carbon mechanism adjustment to be able to ensure that there's a level playing field. Even in as much as this carbon border adjustment mechanism is being put in place. Remember, there's also European Union that is also advancing the economic partnership agreements between other regional countries from Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific. Right now, there are 33 countries that have a form of EPA with European Union. So how will it be that on one hand they want to implement this BCAM, and yet on the other side they want to implement EPA? So I think that's a bit of some disconnect, unless now even the engagements that we are seeing between Africa and the European Union will also now to be more extensive, in the sense that they could now ramp up the economic partnership agreements, which will not just look at this climate policy goal, which is the focus of the BCAM, but also look at more extensive, be it economic and also the development agenda, so as to be ensured that even Africa is at par with the European Union.
Right. So, Dean, I want to get your perspective on what exactly Africa's options are going to be here, because Africa's total energy supply is very much dominated by biofuels and waste, around 39%, and fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas at around 75%. Now, what options does Africa have here in terms of its manufacturing sector, given that it is very heavily dominated by fossil fuels?
I think, first of all, Africa cannot simply resist. We must respond strategically. First, we need to negotiate for CBAM revenues to be partly recycled into Africa's decarbonization efforts, looking at green steel, low carbon cement, fertilizers from renewables, and also we need to secondly strengthen regional integration under the Africa Free Trade Area Agreement. So when we trade more with ourselves and rely less on vulnerable exports, that will create a new developmental pathway. The other third aspect is building capacity to measure and certify carbon footprints without credible, data, because African producers will be penalized by default values. So in this instance, this brings us to the fourth aspect, looking at mobilizing domestic resources, because already Africa loses about 90 billion every year through illicit finance flows, and more than we receive in aid, actually. So stopping that leakage would fund our transition essentially by ourselves. And I guess as a final point, I think Africa must speak with one voice, whether at the World Trade Organization, whether at the Conference of Parties. Fragmentation essentially weakens us, and unity essentially empowers us. Because if Europe keeps the CBAM revenues, then at least recycle them into Africa's green industries. That, in my opinion, would be climate justice in practice. But at the same time, we also need to bear in mind, how do we then provide, again, the means of implementation for Africa to leapfrog from outdated models, such as fossil gas and oil, and embrace renewable energy. Fundamentally, to the core, the CBAM undermines that progress for Africa.
Right. So, Tunji, I want to come to you on the whole question of where this leaves African countries, because a report by the South African Institute of International Affairs, warns that CBAM could cost some African economies up to 0.9% of GDP and reduce exports to the EU by up to 5.7%. Which African economies do you think will be particularly affected by this?
It does look like Nigeria, South Africa, I think, Ethiopia might be, because they're looking at producing fertilizer and also exporting it. So it does affect the calculations of every deal that is probably on the table, looking at those particular sectors. But I think it's critical for Africa to sit down and ask a question, because fossil fuels developed America, fossil fuels developed the European Union, fossil fuels developed Asia, and now at the point where Africa wants to develop, we are saying Africa needs to develop without burning fossil fuels. It's like asking us to fight with two hands tied behind our back. And the conversation really needs to be, the African leaders need to have a proper conversation, understanding where we are developmentally wise, and put it to the table to say, okay, this is a conversation we need to have, because we cannot develop without having fossil fuels burn. And maybe we need to do it in a more sustainable manner, but to completely eliminate it from our development conversations is almost difficult. It's almost impossible. So we need to have those conversations. And I think, again, I bring it back to the conversation where African leaders need to come together to have this conversation. It can't be one country or the other. It needs to be the entire continent having the conversations with everybody, not just the EU. It needs to be America, it needs to be Asia, it needs to be everybody.
Right. So, Dean, Tunji raised an interesting issue here in terms of the fact that fossil fuels developed Europe. But Africa's contribution to global emissions is very minimal, accounting for about 2 to 4%, while the European Union is still among the world's largest emitters here. Is Europe shifting its climate bill onto Africa?
Yes, so the answer essentially is yes, and it is unjust in effect because Africa essentially is being punished for structural conditions we did not create. We emit only 4% of global greenhouse gases, yet we are asked to pay as if we were the drivers of the climate crisis. Meanwhile, rich countries that industrialized with coal and oil for centuries still dominate the global value chain. CBAM also ignores finance quality. Most climate finance that comes to Africa and the type and the quality that the continent receives as debt, not grants. And it is concentrated in just a few countries like Egypt, Morocco, South Africa. For many others, climate funds are inaccessible or come with strings attached. And justice is not about equal treatment, it is about equitable treatment, recognizing history, capacity, and differentiated responsibility. CBAM essentially flips that logic on its head, and it risks entrenching inequality rather than solving it. And if we look at the fossil fuel or resource curse, or essentially how Europe developed using fossil fuels, rightfully, but if we look at the reality that Africa is currently residing in within the ecosystem of the emerging green global economy, we do not have refining capacity, for example, and we do not have essentially the capabilities to be able to create our own system to which we have energy, for example, which is why we've got 600 million people without energy access. That being said, we need to utilize what we already have as an African continent, which is an endowment of natural resources, our geothermal, our solar, our offshore wind, essentially. How do we repurpose areas in Uganda, areas in the West African power pool, areas for offshore wind across the African continent in order for us to meet Africa's development agenda on the terms for Africans by Africans?
All right, gentlemen, on that note, we're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll look at how Africa can respond to these new tax and explore practical strategies that the continent can adopt. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's now continue with our discussion. Still with me, Churchill Ogutu, Tunji Andrews, and Dean Bekemuzi Ibepe. Churchill, this whole CBAM new tax regulation, what does this mean for African countries that are still very much dependent on carbon-intensive industrialization as a pathway to development?
I think there's an opportunity for them to be able to look at even other markets because the BSAM is pretty much African industries or African and pretty much European Union vis-a-vis the non-European Union, which were not within the energy transition trading system regime. So it's basically European Union vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So in that context, even Africa, as it's trying to explore other markets, because obviously it's a heavy cost for African industries getting into the European market. But the good thing is this is something that has come even post-colonial era, whereby there's positive non-alignment policy, whereby rather than just dealing with a particular colonial power, for instance, or even the Western Union, Western countries, they also are looking at other nascent markets, looking Far East. I've seen developments with China and also the Gulf Council countries, whereby there's some inroads that is being made. So I think the focus will not be just on the European Union per se, but also just diversifying even their markets, looking elsewhere. So I think that is an opportunity that some of the African countries that are industrializing with using these inputs that have been will be slapped with some tariffs within the European Union just to look elsewhere.
Right. Tunji, do you see that impetus gaining with African countries? Are you seeing African countries exploring those other alternative markets as a result?
It's something I think they must look at because if you have invested several billions of dollars in building a factory, you must find a market for it. And you know, a lot of these factories were built without this tariff in mind. So if it is coming into play, it means that, you know, the cost of production has you know, increased. And if it is making it not competitive to be able to export to Europe, you might need to find new markets. And I think, like I said earlier, you know, Africa is still there. My co-panelists did speak about, you know, the Gulf states, LATAM. I mean, it's an opportunity for us to expand our wings. I think this is a good, you know, problem for Africa to have. You know, a continent that has always been known as the consuming continent is now looking for where to sell its produce. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity for us to build new bridges, you know, have new conversations with different countries across the world that will need produce that we've added some value to, and then can give us a new opportunity, so that when we go back to the EU and have those conversations, we come with from a point of strength rather than a point of, you know, begging to sell in their markets.
So Tunji, that being said, though, that this is a good problem for Africa to have, how will this mechanism, though, reshape Africa-Europe trade relations?
I think it's important that Africa needs to know that the EU needs Africa as much as Africa needs the EU. So I think it's a thing where we've never had this kind of conversation before. We've never had a situation where companies or markets in the EU are worried about production in Africa. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity for us to, you know, remove some clauses in existing trade deals and renegotiate some of those trade deals so that we can have better terms for African producers. So I think it's a time where policymakers need to, you know, look at those drafts again and talk about how we can readdress them and, you know, remove clauses, put in new clauses, and make Africa the fun destination now.
Right. So
I'm really excited about this, actually.
Great. So, Dean, let me come to the whole question of climate financing for a moment here, because the estimated total financing needs for Africa's climate adaptation and energy transition are around $1.3 to around $1.6 trillion for adaptation and significant investment to shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Why should Africa pay Europe's carbon tax? Should Africa be paying Europe's carbon tax?
The answer is no. I mean, essentially, if we look at how this will affect Africa, particularly at home and globally, right? CBAM will essentially discourage investments in industries we desperately need to grow. Steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizers. Now, these sectors are not just factories. They are job creators, technology absorbers, and the foundation of industrial ecosystems. Now, blocking their exports risks leaving Africa trapped in raw commodity dependence. Now, remember, we're functioning in a system where Africans are producers of what we don't consume and we consume what we don't produce. Globally, the picture is also troubling because African exports will lose competitiveness in one of the largest markets, the European Union. Producers may try to divert goods to Asia, and the margins will then cause a ripple effect, to which the margins will shrink and SMEs will be squeezed out. This is a possibility. Now, the AFDB estimated, as earlier said, 25 billion being lost annually. That's the money that otherwise fund industrialization and livelihoods. And all this while Africans contribute, again, less than 4% of the global emissions, but carries the heaviest climate impacts. We are essentially being asked to decarbonize an economy we decarbonize. And that is essentially correct. Rightfully so, we need to decarbonize, given the climate collapse. But we need to be provided with the means of implementation. And by that is acknowledging that the global north owes Africa a climate debt. And by virtue of that, it is them who's meant to fund our transition and our decarbonization journey.
Right. So, Churchill, you know, other regions as well have voiced criticism on this new policy. China has called CBAM unfair and inconsistent with WTO rules. India says it is a trade barrier and is considering a legal action against it. If even these industrial giants are struggling, what chance does Africa really have?
I mean, it's a lopsided fight. And if you look at even the bolts and nuts as to how they become pricing, the pricing is actually implemented, it raises some concern in the sense that from next year, 2026, so they'll be looking at all the imports from Africa to Europe, and then they slap the pricing based on some certification of sorts. And this pricing will be based on the pricing that was lapped on the European developers. So it's like what you've been hearing about, the African emission is like 4% of the total emission, but yet we'll be paying the cost, which is equivalent to the emission of European countries. So from that perspective, I mean, it's lopsided even from the WTO or goals, and this pretty much tied to the pushback that you are hearing from the likes of China and the India. And even if you look at the legislation that brought about CBAM, there were some aspects towards also assisting some of the third countries that ideally will be lapped with the tariffs in the sense that they need to come in, European countries, to assist even in those countries, even to develop at a level playing field. So what efforts are we seeing from European Union to be able to assist these countries? So it should be fair enough that even if tariffs are being slapped on African countries, we need to see some developments that is also coming from Europe to Africa to be able to assist, to be able to level the playing field. Having said that, we need to also see efforts around economic partnership agreements, which is much more broader reforms in terms of the trade and also development, things such as the green energy, digital economy, needs also to be incorporated, and we need to see much more headroom in terms of implementing these reforms, in as much as BSAM, because I'm not seeing that is going anywhere soon. So we need to see at least efforts being put in areas that could now be able to stimulate the growth for African industries within this BCAM regime.
Right. So, Dean, I want to get your final comment here. What practical strategies should countries adopt to protect their economies and also ensure a fair transition?
I think we need to think around building Africa's green industrialization. By that, I mean implement a pan-African green industrial policy. How do we institutionalize policies that already exist, such as the African Green Mineral Strategy within the Africa Free Trade Area Agreement frameworks? How do we expand regional value chains? By this instance, we're thinking around how do we treat transition minerals and intermediate products as African regional assets? How do we facilitate multi-country refinery and manufacturing zones to distribute benefits and reduce duplication? How do we deepen intra-African trade in transition minerals and processed green crudes? How do we design and adopt a green industrialization index, building on the existing African industrialization index by adding a green matrix, measure the performance? How do we even use the index as a benchmarking tool for national and regional planning? Lastly, how do we accelerate and broaden tech transfer and sharing and waivers with partners such as China? How do we establish a pan-African innovation cluster that is focused on renewable energy, batteries, and agro-processing? And how do we incentivize joint ventures and public-private partnerships with conditions for knowledge sharing? And how do we at the same time prioritize that South-to-South cooperation with countries such as China? And then the final point would be, how do we engage proactively in global governance? If we look at how we advocate in terms of African representation in setting global standards on how we can leverage our transition minerals, our ESG rules, our climate trade measures, for example. How do we push for binding international agreements on fair technology transfer and local beneficiation? How do we use regional blocs like the AU to influence the multilateral negotiations more assertively, would be my takeaway.
All right. Thank you all very much for your insights. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Churchill Ogutu, economist at IC Group, Tunji Andrews, CEO, Our Bar, and Dean Bekemuzi Febe, Senior Just Energy Transitions and Campaign Advisor at PowerShift. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's goodbye.